Hello, YouTube, Internet, world. Welcome back. Let's talk movies. Today, I would like to discuss La La Land. This movie, I think, is a little more divisive than I think it should be. And I want to say right off the bat that I enjoyed this movie. I thought it was fun. And the reason I want to say that right off the bat is because I do have a number of negative things to say about it. And I don't want anyone to think that just because it has problems that it's not fun. And the reason I want to point out the problems is because it wouldn't be fair for me to say that this is a great movie, particularly when there are so many people who are praising it as being something so much better than it is. But I need to say ahead of time that I did enjoy it, because you have the other side that decries it as being some horrible piece of cinema, which it absolutely is not. And then, of course, there were social implications dealing with cries of racism and whitewashing, and I think there might be an argument for that in there somewhere. However, I'll talk about that a little bit. I try to stay away from political issues in my videos, particularly just because unless a film is specifically talking about it, I don't think that it's my place to say, because my area of focus is cinema itself, not on political hot buttons. That's not really my place to say in this format. Maybe someday I'll start a format or do a different format that will deal with that kind of stuff. But right now, I just am going to deal with the cinema, and when necessary, based on the film itself and the story, I will tackle those issues. So, La La Land. The reason I don't, not the reason I don't like, the issues that I have with this film, and although I found it very interesting and maybe even clever, the choice of having the cinematography itself go from being whimsical and more freeform to more grounded as the film progresses, I thought that was an interesting choice. However, my problem with it is those initial scenes, and the scenes where it's really just all over the place and swinging around and zooming in, and just so much movement with the camera. My problem with it is it really, to me, it felt more like a live episode of So You Think You Can Dance, or a show like that, where the camera is just swinging around and zooming in and going out of the way and leaving its frame. And to me, it was more distracting than it was interesting. It didn't help the plot. It took me out of the movie altogether. And from watching this, I get the idea that he was going for kind of a live performance when you're in the mental landscape of the music scenes, and that in itself is a problem that I have, because it essentially makes the movie feel like two different movies. You have the dreamscape movie, which is, a musical, and then you have the everyday life movie that's just a romance. And individually, they're both interesting and fine, but when you put them together, they feel very disjointed. And my problem with that in particular is the fact that he's trying to ground a musical into our reality. He's trying to make it part of our world by making it an inner understood communication between two people as opposed to actual communication between two people. Is making the metaphor of communication into a visual medium instead of, like with classic musicals, where they just create an entirely new reality, an entirely new universe where dancing and singing is just part of it. And even in those old musicals, you have moments and elements of detachment from reality with, like, in particular, American in Paris, the whole last, like 15 minutes is this dream sequence. But it's set up as a dream sequence. It's not intermingled into the reality of the film. And so I have a real problem with that, and this is I need you to understand, this is a personal preference. So this isn't an attack on the movie. This is why I didn't identify with the movie very well. I grew up on the classic musicals, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Gene Kelly. Singing in the Rain was one of my favorite movies until I was probably in my mid-teens, and those are the Funny Face, like those are the movies that I grew up on and that I loved and really resonated with me, on top of the other movies that I really loved as well. But like, musicals have always been a very important part of my life and my childhood. No matter how much I tried to protest in my childhood when I thought that they weren't masculine enough, I secretly, and sometimes not even secretly, but openly, loved those movies. And my dad always got them for my sister, but I always loved when we put them in and could watch them, and just I loved them so much. So that's my context for watching a musical. So when I watch something like this, it's much more influenced by musicals and stage productions that came from out of the 60s and 70s, which isn't really a context that I've really immersed myself in. And what I have experienced from that time period as far as musical goes, I don't like as much, and I don't identify or they don't resonate with me as much. So the fact that so much of his influence comes from that time period of musical is something that kind of took me out of this movie as well. And so that's another thing. Like, there are so many. There's so much homage in this movie. There's so much reference in this movie that it's scarcely its own movie. Like, most of, particularly the musical numbers, are alluding to something else, and that kind of bothered me a little bit too, because the things that it's alluding to were better than it. And once again, personal opinion based on what speaks to me, and I understand why some people will absolutely love it, because it's mixing genres that they happen to like more. But for me, like I said, the one of the best parts of a musical is the fact that it posits a universe in which just singing and dancing is just part of it. They don't have to create a separate dreamlike landscape in order for it to make sense. It just is. And I kind of, I would be fine if that was just one scene where they went way over the top and did like a dream sequence scene, and then the rest of the movie was just kind of grounded in its own reality. But that's not the way it is. Like I said, it's two different things. It's when they're communicating through speech, they're in just normal boundaries of the natural laws. But then when they start singing, it becomes obvious that it's a metaphorical and representation of the conversation, not the conversation itself, or maybe not even the conversation, but the moments in which these people are communicating. So to me, I don't like that separation. I didn't like it. It didn't work for me. So, and then I couldn't help but notice that there was a certain level of cynicism in the movie, and I don't. It's not overt. It's not an overt cynicism, but there's this. It's in the story structure itself where the main focus of the movie is people pursuing their own self-interest. And the sacrifice that they make is not really a personal sacrifice. It is instead just a means to get to where they want to be. And one of the reasons why I enjoy classic musicals is because embedded within the musicals are classic love stories. They're not meant to be a representation of reality. They're meant to be this coming together of two people in a whimsical way. And, you know, it's essentially the idea of a childlike fairy tale, and that's fun sometimes, you know. In this movie, there isn't that. The whimsy is much more of a cynical whimsy. You know, it points out the most problematic and troubling and abhorrent aspects of Hollywood. The fact that your talent doesn't mean anything. The fact that you know, you have to rely on these things that you hate in order to get to a starting point to eventually, if you're lucky, be able to do your own thing. It's just this soul-crushing cynicism that you have to just accept a level of a level of integrity that's not ideal. You know, you can't be you can't have the idea of a virtue in this setting. The virtuous, as it's presented here, don't succeed. It's the people who just allow themselves to become what they hate in order to become what they love. And I think that's very indicative of Hollywood, and so I understand what they're going for. But when I'm watching a musical, and in particular a musical at the center focal point of which is a romance story, that's not what I want to see. If I want to watch something like that, I'll watch Blue Valentine. You know, it's not a musical, and it wouldn't serve itself as a musical. And perhaps maybe I'm too much of a purist or too much of a classicist. Someone who likes classics too much. Perhaps maybe that is true, but to me, you know, like I said, this movie did not resonate with me as well as it could have because of that issue. You know. But once again, I don't want these negative things to make you think that I didn't enjoy the movie. I had a great time watching it. It's just these are things that after watching it, I had to come to terms with based on how I reacted to the film. You know, I wanted so badly for this to be an absolutely incredible movie, and I believed that it would be, but I had to step back and really try to understand what I actually think about the movie, and that's what I'm communicating with you, is what I actually think and how I perceived this movie and how it was told. And to the way I saw it and the way that it was communicated in the film, it wasn't about two people becoming one. It was about two people just traveling parallel paths, and I don't find that to be particularly dynamic. It just kind of fell flat for me. So yeah, I mean, that's my complaint, really. But I mean, it's the colors were vibrant and fun, and there were aspects of it that were just really did ring true of classic Hollywood, and were at least paying homage to it, which was definitely fun. And for someone who enjoys old cinema and classic cinema like myself, it was, there were definitely aspects of it that were fun. I have to say my favorite scene in the whole movie is when Emma Stone walks by the wall, the mural of all the classic Hollywood stars. It was really fun just looking at that mural, which I know sounds horribly boring and doesn't really speak much to the film, but I loved it. I loved being able to see all the pictures and all the characters, the caricatures of the old Hollywood stars. So yeah, and I mean, I can't complain about the music either. The music was good. A lot of people did complain about how they really should have cast people who were better, singers and dancers, and I think there's an argument for that. I think that they probably could have found people who are maybe a little better. But I didn't mind. I didn't think they did a bad job. I thought they did perfectly fine. They were serviceable. And I have to say that I find particularly Ryan Gosling to be extremely charming and easy and fun to watch. So, I didn't have a problem with him. And I think he has a very classic look to him, which not many modern actors do. So for that role, I thought he did a great, or I guess I thought his face did a great job, because he really did look the part. He fit the part really well. I thought he, as far as if you're just going on looks and just going on how he fit into that narrative, I thought that he was a better fit than Emma Stone was, even if Emma Stone is probably, at least in this, a better representation of an actor. She was able to emote better, I think. But, I don't really think there's any basis in people complaining about the casting, really. And this brings to the next thing, the people complaining about the racial issue of it, the whitewashing. I totally understand. There are definitely not enough minorities in film. There's a lot of roles that I think would be better written or better understood if cast with different people. In this movie, I mean, I could definitely see it going either way, but the way it was written, it would have to be completely rewritten if we were to cast, in particular, minorities, and in general, just someone else. The whole movie would have to be rewritten, and like one of the complaints that people have is when Ryan Gosling is explaining jazz, and the reason why that would have to be rewritten is if we cast a black man, is because when he explains jazz incorrectly. So I think that his explanation and his stance on jazz is very much indicative of a white guy trying to understand something that he just hasn't been immersed in. It's something that he loves, but it's not something that he feels, or maybe not feels. It's not something that he has experienced yet. And I mean, at the risk of sounding like a white guy explaining jazz, which, I will never be able to fully explain where the heart of jazz, but I mean, there have been plenty of white jazz musicians and composers throughout the years, and some of them are amazing and really understand the concept of it. But the very idea that he says to Emma Stone that he wants to save it and protect it, using language like that it really casts light on the fact that he doesn't understand even really what art is. You can't save and protect art. You can't do that. It's I mean, particularly if you want to make it, it's fully and completely an act of self-expression. It comes from within. So there's not any way that an outside force can stifle it for what it is. Now, maybe a better way of him explaining it would have been, I want more people to hear it and understand it. Maybe that would be more of what he was trying to say. But the fact that he was saying verbiage like he wants to save it and protect it is indicative of someone who doesn't really understand what art is or where it comes from. Once again, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to explain jazz to anyone. I'm more speaking in terms of art itself. But if you look at where the history of jazz, he talks about how jazz is divisive and at odds. And I think that he's conflating the cultural impact of jazz with the art of jazz itself. Now, I would say that the dissonance in jazz is an internal dissonance, and it's a cultural dissonance. It's being very strong-willed, if you will, towards the established understanding of things. That's contextually and historically where jazz is birthed, is this anti-culture movement of sorts. And the dissonance within self is you're wrestling with the balance between cultural conformity and free expression, and that's where the dissonance comes in. But when you are creating that art, and particularly when he's talking about it, and you have musicians who are just one person going on a solo, and then another person chiming in and starting their solo, that isn't dissonance. That is teamwork like you'll never see anywhere else. That is a community, a very small community in that instance, coming together to make something by conjoining all the individual parts. Like there's no dissonance in that. There's something very fluid in it. It's almost spiritual. It's almost it's almost an expression that is necessitates a culture of people understanding the feel of the art itself, understanding when to start, when to stop, when to let someone take stage, when to take stage yourself. That's the opposite of what dissonance is, and he tries to say that that's what it is. But that, like I said, is combining the cultural dissonance of jazz with the art itself, which expresses a misunderstanding of what jazz and what art is. And I think his journey in the movie, and this maybe is what was actually meant to be the story, his journey in the movie is getting to a point where he stops trying to save and protect art and instead is just free to make it. So I think that maybe is the story that was trying to be conveyed, and in conveying that story, maybe some people misunderstood, or maybe the director himself or the writer himself misunderstood. I don't want to say that because it's their art and they're creating it. I don't want to, impose the way that I see it on what is actually meant to be. But, based on that one conversation that he had with Emma Stone when he's trying to explain jazz and its importance, I think he kind of misses the mark on like I said, art in particular, altogether. So, and that's why I think that looking at it that way, I think that his story is so much more compelling than Emma Stone's story is, because in Emma Stone's story, all that she learns is that in this industry, it matters more who you know than what you know or how talented you are. That's her arc. Her arc is that she is a very talented actress, but she can't succeed at what she wants to until she meets the right person. And I mean, that is very indicative of the industry, and I think that's very true, and that taps into the reality of their situation. But I find that story to be far less compelling than, Ryan Gosling's character, where he understands that art is not about saving and protecting, it is about doing. It is about creating and experiencing. I don't know. Maybe it's not as interesting as I think it is, but like I said, I need to once again iterate that this is definitely my opinion. There are some movies that I will stand more firmly on when it comes to whether or not they're good or bad, based on the virtue of the craftsmanship and the final outcome. This movie, the craftsmanship is good. Some of the writing is not great, and some of the story elements are not great. But overall, it's a competent film, and it's enjoyable, and it's fun. And a lot of the elements that I don't like stem from my essentially love of classic cinema. So, I understand why a modern audience might find this more enjoyable than, say, a Top Hat, or Shall We Dance, the original Shall We Dance with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. So I mean, I hate coming on here and just spouting opinions because there's not that doesn't mean anything really to any of you, because you're going to have a different opinion. But I think that if you combine all of the opinions that you can about something, it helps you think about it. So even if you don't agree with me, maybe it'll change the way you think about it a little bit, and maybe if you share your opinions with me, it'll change the way I think about it, and we'll all become better people. And I think that one of the reasons why I like stories and movies so much is because it is much easier to share an opinion on something as innocuous as a movie, as opposed to sharing your opinion on something as divisive as politics or religion. And I think that if you can take the small steps of being able to communicate with one another, well, over something as insignificant as a movie, you can then extrapolate and learn to communicate amicably with people about more important topics. So I mean, I think that's one of the many important roles of story and cinema, and one of the reasons why I love it so much, and one of the reasons why I want to continue the conversation. So let's never stop talking. Let's never stop talking about movies. Let's never stop discussing them. Let's keep moving forward and becoming better people. Thank you all for watching. Please like, please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing, and I will talk to you all next time.